It's the 5th of September 2012. In a remote car park in the French Alps, a horrific incident has just taken place. A slain cyclist lays motionless on the floor. A bullet-riddled car full of people is stuck on an embankment, engine revving and wheels spinning rapidly. A distressed youth has just collapsed in front of this out-of-control vehicle, and British cyclist Brett Martin is wondering what the hell he's just stumbled upon. Combe Deer State Forest Road is a scenic 8-mile stretch in the French Alps, whose main purpose is to allow access for forestry vehicles and equipment to maintain the vast woodlands it ascends into. However, public vehicles are allowed access up to about halfway along the road, where a car park called Parking du Martinet signals the end of the line for public vehicle access. Both the road itself and the vast area of forest and paths that run through it are popular with hikers and cyclists in peak tourist season, but it tends to quieten down once summer ends. And it was one quiet, sunny day in September when retired Royal Air Force pilot Brett Martin decided to go for a cycle after doing some maintenance work at his holiday home in the local area. It would come to be a day that he would never forget. Brett was a keen cyclist, and he left his home riding his mountain bike with no particular intention beyond a pleasant afternoon ride through familiar terrain. He made his way through the small village of Cheveline and carried on up the hill, along Forest Road and up towards the Martinet car park. As he drew closer, his first instinct was that he had stumbled upon a road accident. In the distance, a stationary car stuck up on a mound with its engine revving and wheels spinning on the spot. A cyclist was lying motionless on the ground nearby. Brett had in fact seen the same cyclist ahead of him earlier on in his journey and assumed at first glance that he had been struck by the car. But something didn't add up. The cyclist's bicycle was nowhere near him, and the injuries didn't look like those of a man who had been clipped by a passing vehicle. It was then he saw the child. A very young girl was stumbling in the road, bloody and barely conscious. From a distance, Brett's first thought was that she was simply playing, larking about the way a child would, falling over in the road. But as he drew closer, the truth became impossible to ignore. She collapsed on the ground in the path of the car, moaning, her clothes soaked in blood. Brett moved her away from the front of the car, fearing that the vehicle might lurch forward and crush her. She had been shot in the shoulder and beaten around the head. He placed her in the recovery position and checked that her breathing was stable. He then turned his attention to the car. The engine was still running and in gear, its rear wheels spinning in the loose sand of the lay-by. The doors were locked, but the windows were crazed. They were shattered but still in place, so Brett carefully pushed the driver's window in so he could switch the engine off. It was then he realised the car was riddled with bullet holes. Peering in, 3 bodies were visible in the vehicle. There was a lot of blood, Brett told the BBC in an interview, and heads with bullet holes in them. Checking the cyclist more closely, it was obvious he had suffered the same fate and was no longer alive either. Brett tried to call the emergency services, but his phone had no signal. He now faced a devastating choice: stay with the injured youth who was bleeding and barely conscious, or leave her to find help. He concluded, with agonizing reluctance, that carrying her with him risked worsening her injuries, or maybe even killing her. so he left her in the recovery position and cycled back down the mountain as fast as he could. Further down the road, he encountered a French hiker named Philippe who called the emergency services. Philippe later told the newspaper Le Parisien what he had found when he went up to the car park. The young girl lying apparently lifeless beside the car, unresponsive to his voice, unresponsive to him clapping his hands beside her ear. He had spoken a few words of English, having noticed the British license plates on the car, but there was no reaction. Police and emergency services arrived, and the car park was sealed. The young girl was stabilised and transported to a hospital, where she was put into a medically induced coma. The family in the car would later be identified as British national Saad al-Hili, his wife Iqbal, and her mother Suhalia. The cyclist was a local man named Sylvain Mollier. Officers were instructed not to disturb the scene or the bodies until forensics turned up. It was this instruction that meant nobody looked any closer at the car for 8 long hours. At approximately 11 o'clock that night, specialist forensic investigators made a discovery that stopped the investigation in its tracks. Tucked into the rear footwell of the car, beneath the skirt of her dead mother, was a second youth. She was alive and somehow entirely unharmed. She had been there, alone, for the better part of a day. Taking a look at the family, Saad al-Hili was 50 years old, Iraqi-born and British by citizenship, a quietly successful engineer who had lived in the leafy Surrey village of Claygate for many years. He worked as a contractor for Surrey Satellite Technology Limited, a respected company that specialised in the design and construction of small, high-precision satellites, including those used for map making. By all outward appearances, he was an unremarkable, middle-class professional man, as well as a loving father and a husband. His wife, Iqbal, was 47 years old and worked as a dentist. She travelled on an Iraqi passport. Her mother, Suhalia al-Alaf, 74 years old, and a Swedish national, had joined the family for a holiday. The al-Hilis had driven from England through France and were camping by the shores of Lake Annecy, one of the most beautiful destinations in Europe. It was a family holiday, nothing more, or so it seemed. On the afternoon of the 5th of September, Saad drove his wife, his mother-in-law, and his 2 young daughters, Zainab, aged 7, and Zina, aged 4, up the mountain road toward the Martinet car park. The reason he chose this particular road on this particular afternoon has never been established. 25 bullet cases were recovered from the car park. All 4 adults had been shot twice in the head. The attack had been rapid, controlled, and devastating. But one detail stood out to investigators immediately. The cyclist Sylvain Mollier had been shot a total of 7 times. He had sustained far more gunshot wounds than any other victim. For some investigators and analysts, this anomaly would become the foundation of one of the many different theories about what had happened that day, and, crucially, about who the intended target really was. Ballistic analysis eventually confirmed that the weapon used was a Luger P06 semi-automatic pistol, a Swiss military sidearm dating back to the Second World War, firing 7.65 parabellum rounds from a magazine that held just 7 bullets. This meant the killer had to reload not once, but multiple times during the course of the attack. The use of such a weapon, a collector's piece, and considered by experts to be far from the ideal tool of choice for a professional assassin, would itself become a significant clue. Subsequent forensic work would narrow the search for the murder weapon to a remarkable degree of specificity. A production run of just 940 Luger P06 29 pistols, manufactured in 1935. Within days of the murders, the scale and complexity of the inquiry became clear. 40 French officers were assigned to the case under Colonel Marc de Tarlet. Surrey police launched their own parallel investigation. French and British detectives began working together, though early reports noted that the language barrier was slowing the process down considerably. British cyclist Brett Martin's involvement in the investigation did not end the moment he rode down that mountain. In the days that followed, he was taken back to the Martinet car park under armed police protection to assist French investigators, retracing his movements, identifying where he had found 7-year-old Zainab, and recounted precisely what he had seen. It was during this outing with the police that they realised the gushing mountain creek that ran parallel and zigzagged under the forest road provided a loud enough roar to block out other nearby loud noises. It was curious to some, Brett himself included, that he had not heard the gunshots at the time of the shooting, and this roaring creek turned out to be the answer. Zainab was brought out of her medically induced coma and given the necessary psychiatric attention. Police had hoped that they would get some answers from her, but the poor girl was so traumatized, experts said she had likely repressed a lot of what had happened. All she could confirm was that there was one single bad man that had committed the atrocity. Back in England, the Al-Hilli family home in Claygate, Surrey, was searched. At one point, a bomb disposal unit was called to examine a suspicious shed at the bottom of the garden. Neighbouring properties were briefly evacuated, but the items found were later confirmed to be non-hazardous. The search did yield a taser, which is illegal to possess in the UK. I thought that was quite an interesting find for such a clean-cut, middle-class gentleman. The family's BMW in France was transported to Paris for detailed forensic examination. In Sweden, investigators began making inquiries related to the property of Suhaila al-Alaf, Iqbal's mother. And in Switzerland, something significant emerged. Swiss prosecutors confirmed that Saad al-Hilli had visited a bank in Geneva in the days shortly before the murders. A bank account in his name was discovered, containing approximately €1 million. Where that money had come from, and what it represented, would become one of the most intriguing threads of the entire investigation. Meanwhile, Marc de Tarlet, the French colonel leading the investigation, flew to Britain and met with Surrey police at Woking police station. Emerging to speak to reporters afterwards, he made a statement that would set the direction of the investigation for months to come. Without any doubt, he said, the reasons and causes have their origins in this country. It was a bold and unequivocal declaration, and it pointed, most investigators believed, directly at one person. Zaid al-Hilli was 54 years old and lived in Chessington, Surrey, not far from his late brother's home in Claygate. The two men had not been close for some time. The reason, investigators came to understand, was money. Their father, Kadim al-Hilli, had died some years earlier, leaving behind an estate of considerable and disputed value. The inheritance dispute between the two brothers had been bitter, protracted, and, by some accounts, deeply personal. it had wound through legal channels in multiple countries. A BBC investigation broadcast in 2013 alleged that Zaid had attempted to forge his father's will and also tried to take credit cards out in his name, a revelation that cast a long shadow over his character and his relationship with his late brother. These were not the actions, many observed, of a man at peace with his family's financial arrangements. In June 2013, Zaid al-Hili was arrested by Surrey police on suspicion of murder. He denied any involvement and offered to take a lie detector test. Ultimately, Surrey police concluded there was insufficient evidence to charge him, and he was released on bail. By early 2014, that bail was lifted entirely. Whether the inheritance dispute provides a genuine motive for murder, or whether it was always a misleading thread, remains a matter of significant debate. What is not in dispute is the depth of the animosity between the two brothers, nor the very large sums of money at the centre of it. Saad al-Hili was not simply a Surrey engineer who happened to have been born in Iraq. His history, and his family's history, was considerably more complex than that. And as investigators dug deeper, a web of connections emerged that some believed pointed towards a motive far removed from a family inheritance dispute. Saad's father, Kadim, had left Iraq decades earlier. The precise circumstances of his departure were, according to various intelligence sources, open to more than one interpretation. Some accounts described him as a man who had fallen foul of Saddam Hussein's regime in the 1970s and fled to Britain. Other accounts, and these came from intelligence sources in both Germany and Switzerland, told a very different story. That Kadim had in fact managed secret financial accounts on behalf of the regime, and that his departure from Iraq had been anything but a clean break. The Mail on Sunday reported in November 2012 that intelligence sources had linked Saad to a secret trust registered in the tax haven of Liechtenstein, believed to contain up to £15 million. This money was allegedly connected to Saddam Hussein's regime as part of billions of dollars that were hidden abroad during his reign. Emails and phone calls intercepted by the Swiss intelligence agency FIS and subsequently passed to their German counterparts suggested that Saad may have been on the verge of accessing some of this money shortly before his death. As previously mentioned, he had also been linked to a separate Swiss bank account containing approximately €1 million. However, French prosecutor MacLeod, while confirming that the al-Hili family's financial affairs and Iraqi connections were at the top of investigators' agenda, stated publicly that he knew absolutely nothing about any links to Liechtenstein, and denied that German or Swiss intelligence had provided his team with any important information on the matter. Whether that represents a genuine lack of knowledge or a deliberate deflection is impossible to say. What it does confirm is that this thread, compelling as it appears, remains unverified and contested. Whether this is connected to his murder, nobody can say with certainty, but the timing, a Geneva bank visit, a €1 million account, intercepted communications, and then 4 people shot dead on a remote mountain road, has struck many analysts as difficult to dismiss. There is also the question of Saad's professional life. He worked at SSTL, a company developing high-precision map-making satellites. In the aftermath of the murders, MacLeod himself raised the spectre of a more shadowy motive. If you are talking about foreign states and industrial espionage, the prosecutor said, you could also be talking about Secret Service involvement. It was reported separately that Saad had been placed under surveillance by the Metropolitan Police Special Branch Unit during the Second Gulf War. Scotland Yard declined to comment on this. Saad had also, it emerged, applied for a position at CERN, the European Nuclear Research Facility in Geneva. And in the days before the murders, fellow campers at the Lake Annecy site later recalled that he had been behaving oddly, leaving his family alone for stretches of time each day, and switching campsites at short notice without explanation. None of this proves anything, but taken together, it paints a portrait of a man whose life may have contained dimensions that even those closest to him did not fully understand. And then there is Sylvain Mollier, the slain cyclist. Any serious examination of the Chevaline massacre must grapple with the uncomfortable fact that Mollier was shot more times than anyone else at the scene. 7 bullets, an entire magazine. That disparity demands explanation. Mollier was a local man and father of 3. He worked in the area and was well known in the community. On the afternoon of the 5th of September, he had been cycling alone on the Forest Road, a route he reportedly took regularly. Some investigators and a number of journalists have pursued a theory that turns the entire case on its head, that Sylvain Mollier, not Saad al-Hili, was the primary target, that the al-Hili family were not the intended victims at all, but had the catastrophic misfortune to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Mollier, it is known, had his own complications. He was involved in a dispute concerning his partner's family-owned pharmacy business, which was reported to be worth a significant sum. The details of this dispute are less thoroughly documented in the public record than the al-Hili family's affairs, and it must be stated clearly that this theory remains less substantiated than the others. There is no named suspect, no established motive of sufficient weight, and no forensic evidence that specifically points to Mollier as the primary target. If Mollier was the target, then the killer was faced, upon his arrival, with an unexpected complication. An entire family had also driven up the road and parked in the car park. What followed may have been an act of brutal improvisation, a decision to leave no witnesses. It's a theory that some investigators have taken seriously. It is also a theory that has never been proven. The gun that was used in the shooting offered investigators their most tantalizing clue and their most maddening dead end. Experts insist that the Luger P06 is not a weapon that a professional killer would choose. It's the kind of firearm that ends up in the hands of a collector, someone who appreciates its history and its mechanics, rather than its reliability in the field. The idea that it jammed during the attack, at the moment when Zainab al-Hili lay wounded on the ground, is widely accepted by investigators as the reason she survived. The identification of the specific production run, 940 pistols, manufactured in 1935, of Swiss military origin, narrowed the search enormously. In 2023, an investigating judge ordered detectives to actively monitor classified advertisements for comparable firearms, in the hope that the weapon might one day surface on the collector's market. To me, this just sounds like wishful thinking, but I suppose they have to try every angle they can. The profile of the killer, assembled by investigators over the years, is, in some ways, more striking than any of the individual leads. A British forensic psychologist, engaged by the cold case unit, concluded that the perpetrator was most likely male, local to the area, and aged between 30 and 40 at the time of the murders. His assessment was that the killings bore the hallmarks of a spree killer acting on independent motives, someone whose reasons for violence may have had nothing whatsoever to do with the specific identities of the victims. This conclusion was dramatically reinforced by the findings of a French military weapons and tactics expert, who assessed the evidence presented at a 2024 reconstruction of the crime. His conclusion was unambiguous. The shooter had been highly trained. The accuracy displayed, firing such a pistol on the move, under extreme stress, against multiple targets, was not consistent with an amateur. He profiled the likely perpetrator as a former Swiss serviceman, now in his 50s, who had, in his words, completely lost the plot. In the course of their renewed investigation, the Nanterre Cold Case Unit examined a case that had been previously considered entirely separate: the 2011 murder of Xavier Balagan, a 29-year-old Belgian man who was shot dead at a motorway rest stop in the Meurthe-et-Moselle region of France. Balagan had been shot 5 times. The final shot was fired at close range to the head. The similarities to Chevaline, a remote location, an ambush-style attack, an execution-style killing, were noted. More significantly, the weapon used to kill Balagan was a Schmidt-Rubin K31 rifle, another old piece of Swiss military hardware from approximately the same era as the Chevaline Luger. A Belgian weapons collector with access to both types of firearm was traced and interviewed, but he was ultimately cleared of any involvement. A Danish man was found to have camped in proximity to both crime scenes around the relevant dates, and he too was investigated, but was also cleared. The possible link between the two cases remains officially unconfirmed, but it's never been dismissed either. Chief Prosecutor Linné Bonnet-Mathis has insisted publicly that the case is far from a cold case, and that advances in forensic science may yet provide the breakthrough that all these years of investigation have not. Eric MacLeod, the prosecutor who stood outside Woking police station in September 2012 and declared that the answers lay in Britain, has since offered a more sombre reflection. He's admitted, in more recent interviews, that the case may never be solved. Was Saad al-Hili killed because of a bitter family dispute over millions of pounds? Or was he targeted because of what he knew, or what he could access from his father's murky financial past, buried in the ledgers of Saddam Hussein's Iraq? Was he killed because of his work with satellites? Because of what he had seen or built or spoken about? Or was he simply, devastatingly, in the wrong place at the wrong time? A blameless man who happened to drive his family up a mountain road on the same afternoon as a madman looking for a thrill. The motive, and the question of who was truly meant to die that afternoon, remains, as of this writing, unknown.